America should keep her mouth shut. Wherever there's a corrupt regime, as much hell as America has raised on the earth.
The result of what we've learned from writings by Christopher Columbus's own men. He raped, pillaged, enslaved, and slaughtered people just to get rich.
4 centuries of trafficking in human beings, and over the course of that time, we're talking about millions of souls involved and millions of souls lost.
More than 3,000 Native American children died in the custody of the U.S. government after they were forced to attend so-called Indian boarding schools.
When, without telling Puerto Rican women that they were going to be sterilized, they started doing that to stop the Puerto Rican population.
60,000 people had been forcibly sterilized in the U.S. by the 70s, and there have been hundreds of thousands more where the consent was really questionable.
Hundreds of thousands of Japanese Americans were rounded up and sent to internment camps under suspicion of disloyalty to the United States.
Hundreds of Pachucos were rounded up regardless of affiliation. 22 were eventually found guilty for the Sleepy Lagoon murder.
Systemic racism, use of slave labor, inhumane treatment and outright torture of prisoners, and the commodification of human lives to be locked up in order to increase profits is truly wrong in every way.
I ain't saying I'm innocent in all this. I'm just saying this white man's world. This song's to y'all. For all those times that I mess up or we mess up.
What we're really celebrating today is Taino Genocide Day. The day when Christopher Columbus began to wipe out an entire indigenous population in a way that would even make Pol Pot blush. In 1492, Columbus was on a manic hunt for gold when he set sail and eventually landed on a small island off the coast of North and South America, an island today named Hispaniola, which is split between the nations of Haiti and the Dominican Republic. As Columbus wrote in a letter to the King and Queen of Spain, "Gold is most excellent. Gold constitutes treasure. And he who has it does all he wants in the world and can even lift souls up to paradise." But when he landed in what he called the New World, there wasn't much gold to be found. But he did find something he thought was just as good as gold: people, who, in Columbus's mind, would make great slaves. So he wrote to the Spanish monarchs, "They are well built, with good bodies and handsome features. They do not bear arms and do not know them, for I showed them a sword, and they took it by the edge and cut themselves out of ignorance. They have no iron. Their spears are made of cane. They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subject them all and make them do whatever we want. And here there are so many of these slaves. Although they are living things, they are as good as gold." What Columbus did to the island and the tragedy he brought to the native population there has been largely erased by time and replaced by a glorified story of a bold explorer who set out to change the planet. In reality, though, as a result of what we've learned from writings by Christopher Columbus's own men, he raped, pillaged, enslaved, and slaughtered people just to get rich. Not exactly the type of guy worthy of a Main Street parade. One of Columbus's crewmen, Miguel Queno, described the scene when Columbus first arrived in Hispaniola for the second time, and thousands of Tainos, or what were referred to as Indians, came out to greet the ships. Queno wrote, "When our caravels were to leave for Spain, we gathered 1,600 male and female persons of these Indians. For those who remained, we let it be known to the Spaniards in the vicinity that anyone who wanted to take some of them could do so to the amount desired, which was done." Queno went on to write that he took his own sex slave, a beautiful teenage girl who, in his words, quote, "resisted with all her strength," quote, end quote, leaving him no other choice but to, quote, "thrash her mercilessly and rape her," end quote. And when Columbus's men did good work, Columbus routinely presented them with their very own sex slaves. But that was just the beginning. Columbus eventually started up a global child sex slave trade, exporting Indians all around the world. As he bragged to a friend in a letter written in 1500, 100 castellanos, as a Spanish coin, are as easily obtained for a woman as for a farm. And it is very general, and there are plenty of dealers who go about looking for girls. Those from 9 to 10 years old are now in demand. Eventually, under Columbus's orders, life for the Taino on their homeland of Hispaniola became so bad that they resorted to mass suicide. As the Spanish missionary Pedro Cordoba noted in 1517, 25 years after Columbus arrived. As a result of the sufferings and hard labor they endured, the Indians choose and have chosen suicide. Occasionally, 100 have committed mass suicide. The women, exhausted by labor, have shunned conception and childbirth. Many, when pregnant, have taken something to abort and have aborted. Others, after delivery, have killed their children with their own hands so as not to leave them in such oppressive slavery. By the time Cordoba wrote those words, the indigenous population on Hispaniola had plummeted from roughly 3 million people before Columbus arrived to only 12,000 25 years later. A few decades after that, not one Taino was left on the island. An entire culture and people completely wiped off the map and largely forgotten, thanks to Christopher Columbus.
Kind of suspicious, swearing one day you might leave me for somebody that's richer. Twist the cap off the bottom, I take a sip and see tomorrow. Gotta make it if I had to beg a bubble. Eating love letters.
Enslaved Africans have been shipped to the Americas since the Spanish arrived in the early 1500s. Europeans purchased slaves along the coast of West and Central Africa. The chained captives were forced onto ships destined to the New World for the long and brutal voyage known as the Middle Passage. Conditions on the ships were indescribably inhumane. The enslaved Africans weren't treated as human beings. They were treated like cargo.
Men and women shackled together, stacked on top of each other. There was a process known as tight packing, where you literally had slave trading scientists who tried to figure out the maximum way to squeeze as many human beings as possible into the holds of these ships.
Incredibly, about 12.5 million Africans were shipped to the New World between 1525 and 1866. About 15% didn't survive the journey.
4 centuries of trafficking in human beings. And over the course of that time, we're talking about millions of souls involved and millions of souls lost. And yet people endured. And yet they survived.
The overwhelming majority went to destinations other than North America. Of the 12.5 million Africans shipped to the New World as slaves, it's estimated about 450,000 landed on our shores. While a law passed by Congress in 1808 banned the transatlantic slave trade, thousands of slaves are estimated to have been smuggled into our country up to the Civil War. By 1860, the enslaved population in the United States had grown to about 4 million people, a staggering number when you consider that the national population at the time was 31 million. The horrors of slavery in the United States would persist until 1865, when, following the end of the Civil War, the 13th Amendment was ratified.
For a period of nearly 80 years between the Civil War and World War II, black Southerners were no longer slaves, but they were not yet free.
What happened in that period of time was so much more terrible than anything most Americans recognize or understand today.
In one of the most shameful chapters of American history, generations of black Southerners were forced to labor against their will.
Free black people could be just picked up and put in jail. The sheriff department could sell people to corporations and coal mines.
He locked me up for 3 days. And after that, he said, if I don't go to work, he'll put me in the river down there.
People's lives were truly stolen from them. Their freedom was taken away.
All the southern states used the criminal justice system to put African Americans back into a position as close to slavery as they possibly could.
The repercussions of institutional slavery are still being felt to this day, as African Americans continue to fight for equal rights and for the right to be heard.
Down and quiet. If brothers don't receive their mail, best believe we ride. Eating Jack Mac, staring at the walls of silence inside this cage where they captured all my rage and violence. In time I learned a few lessons never before.
The various Indian tribes that were present in the United States were recognized as separate independent nations in the Constitution itself. So going back to the founding of the country, they were recognized as separate nations. They were not subject to state law. Treaties could not be made with states. They had to be made with the federal government because it was a government-to-government relation, nation to nation, just like the U.S. to Germany or any other country. So they kept passing repeated laws, trying to take the land away from the Cherokee. They were not recognized as legal, but once Jackson was president, he supported the removal of the Indians. The Cherokee argued through the Supreme Court. They always tried to follow the legal procedure, fit in as Americans. They took 2 cases to the Supreme Court that ruled that they could not be removed. They had the right to the land, but the president ignored the Supreme Court and ordered the Army to forcibly remove the Cherokee from all of the area. Some leaders of the Cherokee signed the Treaty of Neoshoda, which was validated by the President and Congress, which gave away the rest of the remaining lands in the state. Others didn't agree with that, didn't want to accept it, but even the ones who didn't want to accept it, once the President had ordered the removal, let everyone know they should not violently resist, they should go along when the time came. In addition to the Army, Georgia mobilized its militia and sent them in to assist with the removal, which is one of the reasons that the leaders encouraged people not to resist. There's a fear that if people did start resisting, there'd be a mass slaughter. The process of the removal became known as the Trail of Tears. The Army and the militias literally went house to house on the Cherokee Nation, grabbing everyone who was there and marching them away. Generally, they weren't even given time to pack bags. They were just taken. They were marched to gathering camps. There were several throughout the state, kept there until everyone in the area had been gathered up, and then they were moved to major transportation centers. And then, primarily by overland, they walked all the way to Oklahoma. They've called this the Trail of Tears because of all the deaths and all the suffering that happened. There were approximately 18,000 Cherokee that were gathered up and removed during the Trail of Tears, and at least 4,000 of them died on the trip to Oklahoma from Georgia and North Carolina. It still is a very significant moment in their history, and it's hard for some of them to even speak of, even after all this time.
Help me raise my black nation, reparations are due. It's true, caught up in this world, I took advantage of you. So tell the babies how I love them, precious boys and girls, born black in this white man's world.
We return now to a dark chapter in U.S. history. More than 3,000 Native American children died in the custody of the U.S. government after they were forced to attend so-called Indian boarding schools. That's according to a new investigation by the Washington Post. That is 3 times the number of lives lost that the government documented in its own investigation released earlier this year. And the real death toll could be much higher. We are joined now by the Washington Post's Dana Hedgepeth. She's one of the lead reporters on this series and is also an enrolled member of the Haliwa Saponi tribe of North Carolina. Dana, welcome back to the NewsHour.
Thank you.
The U.S. government from the 1800s to the 1960s ran these schools. Can you remind us why the government set these schools up in the first place and the kinds of children that ended up there?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. Let's step back for a minute and think about the time of when these schools was set up. Was at a time in the 1800s. They were created by the U.S. government and run in partnership with churches, religious groups, with one goal: to take children from their home, either forcibly or coerce them from their homes in the name of assimilating them into white society. And that was the purpose of them. The idea was to take the children away from their communities and strip them of their language, their culture, their ways, their customs, and again, to keep them into assimilation. Many of these children were, to call them schools, as one of our sources said, they really weren't schools. They were really work camps. Children spent half the day in school learning basic reading, writing, and arithmetic, and the other half really in workshops, fields, manual labor. The idea was not to train them to be doctors or lawyers or accountants, but rather to be doing manual labor jobs.
And as your reporting shows, there was also another motive that if you stripped Native culture from these children, maybe they would be more, and their families might be more compliant to give up their lands to settlers, et cetera.
That's right. Remember, at the time that this policy was implemented, this was the end of the Indian Wars. Gone were the buffalo for many tribes in the West. They had been pushed to reservations at this point, Native Americans had. And so you're talking about as Brenda Child, a Native American historian, says, probably one of the lowest points in Native American culture and life. Then to come and take their children, it gives me shudders, because for any culture, any people in the world, when you go after their children, you are really talking about trying to break a people. The US government had decided that the Indian wars were too expensive at this point, and that it was actually cheaper to, quote unquote, educate Native American children rather than to try to fight them. And this was all in the name of a land grab. During this time period, Native Americans lost over 1 billion acres of land, again, pushed to reservations. They were wards of the state, of the federal government. They were not able to go freely. Everything was run through an agent of their reservation.
As I mentioned, there's this incredible discrepancy in the number of children whose lives were lost in your reporting compared to what the U.S. Department of Interior put out in its findings earlier this summer. How do you explain that discrepancy?
Very good question, and thank you for asking. The federal government, for the first time, under Interior Secretary Deb Haaland, who's the first Native American cabinet secretary appointed to that position, was the first person to ever step back, take a really hard look, and scrutinize her department, the very department that implemented this policy and carried it out. That's a huge step, and kudos to her department for doing that. They worked incredibly hard for 3 years, and they had a lot of findings that really turned the spotlight on themselves. They looked exclusively at federal records, solely at those. It was limited in scope, and they admitted that it was an undercount. They found 973 children died during a 150-year period at these schools. We built upon that work, and along with hundreds of thousands of records from the National Archives, from researchers around the country who had done the work, and we brought all that together to give the most complete accounting that's really been done to date, looking at the systematic effort of 400 schools across the country to wipe out Native Americans' culture.
I use the language of these children died in these schools, and I feel like that's almost a little bit of a sterile way of describing it. Can you talk a little bit about the conditions that these children endured and how they came to the end of their lives?
You're absolutely right. These conditions were horrific. There were 2 government reports done, one by the Merriam Report, Government Commission report in the 1920s that called these substandard. They were grossly inadequate. To call them an education, again, is not even fair. The children were mistreated. They were severely punished, whipped, beaten, starved of food. We found dozens of children who sadly died trying to run away from these schools. A young Navajo boy froze as he was trying to run away from the school. Children died of suicide. We found indications of abuse that likely led to students' death. These are not the schools that your children or my children in modern times would be subjected to. They really were not. And as a very wise woman from the Fort Belknap Indian Reservation said to me, what schools have cemeteries? I mean, just sit with that, right? Schools shouldn't have cemeteries. And so many of these schools sadly did. We found 881 students who were buried, died and buried on their school grounds. Again, that is so very, very wrong. This was a systematic policy to try to eradicate a people.
Being born with less, I must confess, only adds on to the stress. 2 gunshots to my homie's head.
It was in 1917 when the U.S. imposed, and I like to highlight that, because first they went into asking if we want. And there was a referendum, and most of the Puerto Ricans say no. We want to stay Puerto Rican citizen. And that's when the U.S. say, doesn't matter, you are becoming USA citizen. Of course, at that moment, you had to understand they were trying to find people, soldiers, to send to the First World War. So someone came up with this idea, get the Puerto Ricans. And someone else said, they're not USA citizens. So that was the real motivation behind this. But of course, also, it's very important that we understand that it's a second-class citizenship. So Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico do not have the power to vote for the President of the United States. But it's not only that. We don't have the power to elect people from Puerto Rico to go into the USA Congress.
The early stages of Spanish conquest divvied up the tens of thousands of indigenous Taino Indians to either be killed or serve as slaves. African slaves were also brought in large numbers, and all were put to work in mines and on farms. Slave labor converted the island into nothing but a massive cash crop for coffee, tobacco, and sugar. During that time, the Puerto Rican people were constantly under threat, not only from their colonizers, but other empires, the Dutch, French, and British. During the late 19th century, thousands of indigenous people, peasants, former African slaves, and more banded together to mount huge insurrections against the Spanish crown. In 1897, Spain was forced to concede and granted Puerto Rico official sovereignty.
We were independent for 12 hours when we became aware that the U.S. did a military invasion into Puerto Rico through Guanica, July 25th, 1898. They said, okay, so they just got rid of the Spain flag and they put the USA flag. We're not going any place, and they're still there. We're still trying to get them out of there. Immediately, they imposed the currency, they imposed the post office, they imposed the USA citizenship, they imposed recruiting Puerto Ricans to fight every single war that they've been fighting the whole history in the 20th and 21st century. We've been there. So yes, it's like you're a second-class citizen, but we're going to use you.
With a rising industrial economy, U.S. business wanted to make more money out of its colonial project. So the government implemented a series of tax incentives to attract private capital into Puerto Rico, called Operation Bootstrap. Plantations became refineries and factories, causing devastating consequences to the social fabric of the island, and causing a mass exodus of farm workers to the U.S. Those who stayed were subjected to a horrifying racist program. Between 1936 and 1968, the U.S. waged a eugenics campaign to sterilize as many Puerto Rican women as possible. During that time, a shocking 1/3 of all women living in Puerto Rico had their ability to have a child taken away.
First, they went into testing in Puerto Rico for more than 20 years, birth control pills. When it was ready, they brought that here. But a lot of women died in Puerto Rico during that type of experiment. And then they went without telling Puerto Rican women that they were going to be sterilized. They started doing that to stop the Puerto Rican population.
When President Wilson granted citizenship in 1917, virtually zero volunteered to fight for their new flag in World War I. So he made it compulsory, and just 2 months later sent around 20,000 to the killing fields. Since then, Puerto Ricans have been sent to die in every U.S. war. Puerto Rican soldiers were also used as guinea pigs for American chemical weapons and drugs. Not only that, but entire islands of Puerto Rico were turned into testing grounds. The Puerto Rican masses were never willing participants in their colonial subjugation. In the 1930s, the Nationalist Party rose to prominence under the charismatic leadership of Pedro Albizu Campos. But advocating for independence was illegal for U.S. colonies, and Campos was jailed for sedition for the next 26 years. With the nationalist movement growing and hurting corporate profits with mass strikes, U.S. generals ordered several massacres of peaceful demonstrators. At one community march in the town of Ponce in 1937, General Blanton Winship, the appointed dictator of Puerto Rico, ordered the protesters shot. 19 were murdered. Despite the repression, by 1950, the popularity of the Nationalist Party and their demands for sovereignty were making American businessmen sweat. So the Pentagon created a plan to wipe out the party's leaders and its members. But the attack was uncovered, and on October 30, 1950, a woman named Blanca Canales led an armed counterattack on a police station in her town of Jayuya. They forced the surrender of the police and committed an intolerable act of defiance, raising the Puerto Rican flag in place of the American flag. The act inspired people to rise up against colonial authorities in cities all across the island. But empires don't give up their profits easily. The Truman administration drowned the rebellion in blood. He ordered the immediate, indiscriminate bombing of Jayuya, and the U.S. military marched in and declared martial law. Nationalist Party members, or anyone remotely sympathetic to them, were rounded up, imprisoned, and worse. Mercilessly crushed with violence by the U.S. military in their homeland, the fight for independence went the only place it could. In 1954, a factory worker named Lolita Lebron led 3 other armed nationalists into the U.S. Congress, unfurled the Puerto Rican flag, and with a cry of "Que viva Puerto Rico Libre," opened fire. 5 congressmen were shot and wounded. The 4 revolutionaries were arrested and given life sentences. Lebrun had written in what she thought was her final letter, "I am not sorry. My life I give for the freedom of my country. The United States of America is betraying the sacred principles of mankind in their continuous subjugation of my country." Throughout the 80s, the FBI worked to pick off the leaders that survived COINTELPRO. Political prisoners like Oscar Lopez Rivera still languish in U.S. prison, as he has for over 35 years. Today, the FBI continues to relentlessly spy on and attack Puerto Rican liberation activists.
For his family to see. I pass his casket, gently ask him, is there heaven for G? My homeboy's doing life, his baby mama be stressing, shedding tears when her son finally asked that question.
Forced sterilizations in 2020, sadly, as American as apple pie. We know of at least 17 women in ICE custody who've had hysterectomies without their consent.
Who has removed their reproductive organs for no medical reason.
It's wrong on so many levels, but when you look back at our history, the roadmap for how we got here is very clear. We need to talk about the origins of forced sterilization, and that starts with eugenics, selective breeding to create a better race. In the early 1900s, there was fear-mongering about a genetic invasion. Many white Americans were afraid of losing their so-called purity. Demands for building a wall and anti-immigrant laws took off. Sound familiar? Some of the most elite scientists and thinkers in the country came up with a solution. Keep undesirables, basically anyone who wasn't white or physically abled, from having babies by forcibly sterilizing them. It was sold as an uncomplicated operation that just took a few minutes. Politicians and the US public ate it up. By 1907, Indiana passed the world's first mass sterilization law. At least 30 other states quickly followed suit. The official targets of this patchwork of eugenic laws included those labeled unfit, defective, and feeble-minded. But those were synonyms often used for immigrants and people of color. In California, the government mostly targeted Mexican women. In the South, it was Black women. At least 25% of Native American women were sterilized by the late 70s. Puerto Rico became a hotspot, with the highest sterilization rate in the world. Between 1930 and 1970, over a third of all women on the island were left unable to have children. Over 60,000 people had been forcibly sterilized in the US by the 70s, and there have been hundreds of thousands more where the consent was really questionable. It was also successful that the US started to export and sponsor forced sterilizations globally, from Peru and Guatemala to India and China. Soon, hundreds of thousands of women were robbed of their right to decide what to do with their bodies. Oh yeah, and Hitler? Well, he was so inspired by this US movement that he built the entire Nazi eugenics program in its image. Forced sterilization is now recognized as an act of genocide because it can wipe out entire ethnic groups. Okay, so we just covered a lot, and I know this is feeling pretty heavy. Let's get back to what's happening right now, to the woman sterilized in an ICE detention center. Could it be just a few rogue agents, an isolated incident? Sadly, it's not. If it's a well-documented pattern of abuse, it's systemic. This is what happens when we call people illegal. We've already seen ICE take children from their parents, sexually abuse people in their custody, let kids die in cells, repeatedly deny vital medical care, expose people to COVID. Our own staff constantly documents medical negligence and abuse from ICE. We've even sued the government over medical problems multiple times. These sterilizations show just how far ICE thinks they can push it. So now what? Reforms? Sensitivity trainings? Let them investigate themselves? You know the answer. Abolish ICE.
Why you crying? Heard you late night to my bedroom door. Now do you love me, mama? Why they keep on calling me nigga? Get my weight up with my hate and pay them back when I'm bigger. And still thugging in this jail cell, missing my block.
On December 7th, 1941, the Empire of Japan launched an attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. In the following months, hundreds of thousands of Japanese Americans were rounded up and sent to internment camps under suspicion of disloyalty to the United States. But the feelings that paved the road to internment began long before the attack. For more than 80 years, Asian immigrants were viewed as economic threats spurring various laws that effectively banned them from the country. For those who made it to America, the lingering resentment culminated after Pearl Harbor. Motivated by vocal outcries from politicians and military officials, FDR signed Executive Order 9066, empowering the U.S. Army to designate areas from which any or all persons may be excluded. He later formed the War Relocation Authority to establish 10 permanent camps, housing nearly 120,000 Japanese Americans, mostly from the western United States. 2/3 of those interned were native-born American citizens. With only 6 days to dispose of their possessions, residents were forced to sell their belongings and even their homes for small sums of money. Internment camps were often situated in isolated deserts, prone to harsh weather, and surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Within the barracks, internees lived in small one-room apartments with little privacy and constant surveillance. They were only given a standard army cot, blankets, and a small heating stove. Despite these difficult living conditions, internees tried to establish a sense of community, creating newspapers, schools, churches, and farms. Even in the face of persecution, young men came forth to join the military. Nearly 33,000 Japanese Americans served during World War II, many of whom became highly decorated for their valor in battle. Yet as the war continued, public opinion worsened against Japanese Americans. Only 35% of the country thought they should be allowed home once the war was over. This sentiment kept the camps open for over 3 years. On December 17, 1944, the government announced that Japanese American evacuees could return to their homes. When they did return, they found their homes looted and their possessions gone. With work almost impossible to come by, many fell homeless and destitute. At the time, the federal government offered no assistance for those attempting to rebuild their lives. It would take over 40 years before President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, paying reparations to each victim of internment.
No payment can make up for those lost years. So what is most important in this bill has less to do with property than with honor. For here we admit a wrong. Here we reaffirm our commitment as a nation to equal justice under the law.
We still struggling in this white man's world. We must
fight for brotherhood. We must fight for brotherhood.
Born black in this white man's world.
We must fight for brother Geronimo.
The Zoot Suit Riots. In June of 1943, the city of Los Angeles experienced one of the most significant episodes of racial violence in the 20th century, known as the Zoot Suit Riots. Racial tensions had been rising in the city and were made only worse by the biased reporting of the Los Angeles media. When a group of American sailors attacked a group of mostly Mexican Americans in East LA, the city exploded. In hindsight, this seemed inevitable. With many young men overseas as a result of World War II, labor in the United States was in short supply. So in 1942, the US government reached a deal with Mexico named the Bracero Program, which allowed some Mexican citizens to move to the US as temporary workers. Los Angeles already had a large Mexican-American population, but this new influx of workers provoked greater racial animosity. Much of the white population, whose views were echoed in the mass media, blamed Mexican-American teenagers and young adults for various issues in the city, especially crime. Even the way Mexican Americans dressed angered the city's more conservative population. Many young Mexican Americans started donning the zoot suit, a style that incorporated an oversized coat, pork pie hat, long chain, thick-soled shoes, and baggy pants. This fashion evolved out of Harlem nightclubs and was popularized by cultural icons like Duke Ellington and Cab Calloway. The suits themselves weren't inherently offensive, but in the context of World War II, they were. You see, during the war, wool had been rationed in order to make uniforms for the troops. The very manufacturing of zoot suits with their excessive use of fabric was banned, but a black market developed, and so those zoot suit-wearing Mexican Americans, known as pachucos, were seen as unpatriotic. On the night of August 1st, 1942, pachucos were involved in a brawl in a home near Los Angeles' Sleepy Lagoon. The next morning, the body of Jose Diaz was discovered nearby. The media and police quickly blamed the zoot suit-wearing 38th Street gang. Hundreds of pachucos were rounded up, regardless of affiliation. 22 were eventually found guilty for the Sleepy Lagoon murder in what was later considered a great miscarriage of justice. To some, the verdict was grossly unfair. To others, it confirmed what they already believed, that the zoot suit wearers were inherently violent. This all helped to create a powder keg bound to explode. A few months later, a group of 16 American sailors stationed in Los Angeles claimed they were verbally taunted by a group of Pachuco zoot suiters. Seeking retaliation, the servicemen took cabs over to the Mexican neighborhoods in East LA and started attacking those wearing zoot suits with makeshift weapons. The Pachucos were thrown into the street, their zoot suits torn off and burned on the spot. The ensuing riot continued to snowball over the following days. Violence spread to include both Pachucos and young African-American men. But instead of arresting the attackers, police arrested the victims, supposedly for their own protection. By June 8th, the rioting had become so severe that all military personnel were banned from Los Angeles, and military police were brought in to subdue the attackers. Miraculously, no one was killed, but the impact of the zoot suit riots would reach far beyond the number of casualties. Once the dust had settled, Governor Earl Warren commissioned a report that was meant to paint Californians in a more positive light. Instead, the Independent Citizens Commission found the chief cause of the riots was racism, naming the city's newspapers for encouraging the riots and the city government and U.S. military for allowing those riots to continue. Historians view the zoot suit riots as a culmination of anti-Mexican racism that had been building for years in Los Angeles, exacerbated by the stresses of World War II. The riots forced the country to face these problems head-on and confront the systemic oppression faced by Mexican Americans in Los Angeles and throughout the country.
White man's world, for the countless political prisoners who are locked up falsely by this white man.
Change, choose a new direction, and I've been giving out.
Well, more than 2,000 migrant children remain separated from their parents, jailed in detention centers across the United States. The Washington Post reports that federal authorities are collecting mugshots of the detained minors, some showing the children in tears. Immigrant children jailed in a converted Walmart in Texas are being forced to recite the Pledge of Allegiance in English each morning. At some of the facilities, the children are counted in prison-style head counts. In some cases, parents have already been deported while their children remain in U.S. custody.
A 10-year-old from El Salvador, we don't know her name, but she died in U.S. custody on March the 4th. Carlos Gogario Hernandez, 16 years old. Juan de Leon Gutierrez, also 16. 8-year-old Felipe Gomez Alonso. 7-year-old Jacqueline Caal. And a 2.5-year-old boy, we don't know his name either. They were all from Guatemala. And like the unnamed 10-year-old girl, they all died in U.S. custody, essentially alone, who had fallen prey to a policy of criminal detention of undocumented immigrants, and one that more than not separates children from their parents. No child has died in U.S. custody since 2010, until now. Now at least 6 have died. On top of that, Trump has announced a new immigration policy that would make family unification much more difficult for immigrants, especially Latino immigrants, and would also create what has been described as a very racist, merit-based system.
While the masses of the people, white and black, red, yellow, and brown, poor and vulnerable, are suffering in this nation.
You'll often hear the claim that the United States is the freest place on earth, a bastion of personal and societal freedom. For such a supposedly free nation, we sure have a lot of people behind bars. Let's start with some basic facts. The US has the most incarcerated people of any nation on earth, both by sheer numbers and per capita. As of June 2020, there were 2,121,000 prisoners currently serving time in the US, and a total of over 10 million in the prison system, which includes those waiting for trial and those on parole. This number is higher than nations with vastly larger populations like China and India. It's higher than countries the US considers more authoritarian, like Russia or, again, China. It's even higher than the greatest of all boogeymen, the Soviet Union, at the height of Stalin's power. As for our per capita rating, the US incarcerates roughly 655 people per 100,000. No other OECD nation comes close. The UK sits at 140, Canada 107, France 105, Germany 77. China barely cracks 150. All the countries the US likes to cast as authoritarian hellholes, every single one of them incarcerates fewer people and often in far more humane facilities. The US represents 4% of the total world population, but 22% of the world's prison population. When you talk about prison and prisoners, all the racists tend to come out of the woodwork and say things like, well, those other places are all one race, and immigrants are just inherently criminal. Of course, these statements have no basis in reality. Among roughly equally diverse nations and countries with similarly sized immigrant populations, our incarceration rate is still vastly higher in every case. We also need to remind these people that white people go to jail too. They're just let off the hook far more frequently than any other race. But we'll get to that later. Now that you have an idea of just how much of an obsession we have with locking people up, let's talk about some specifics. If you're familiar with my channel, you'll know that I identify one common thread that ties together all of the worst tendencies of the American empire: profit. Companies have always been eager to work with prisons to increase their profits. The companies that provide food to prisoners are only too happy to sell nutritionally deficient slop to the prison industrial complex. It's cheap to produce and nets them a healthy profit. The phone companies that provide basic call functionality to prisoners charge exorbitant pay-per-minute rates because they know how desperate these poor people are to speak to their loved ones. Transportation companies make a killing shuttling prisoners to and from court appearances and between prisons. But more egregious than these examples is the practice of modern-day slavery. You've probably heard that the state of California routinely puts inmates to work fighting fires. Do you know what they're paid for putting their lives on the line? $2 per day, or $2 per hour when they're actively fighting fires. The minimum wage in the US is $7.25 per hour, which is already absurdly low and has been determined not to be a livable wage. Prisoners are paid $2 per hour at best for their labor, less than 1/3 of the federal minimum wage. But wait, it gets worse. Incarcerated people have their own minimum wage. Care to guess what it is? It's not $2, it's 12 cents per hour. Some states, including my home state of Texas, do not require incarcerated workers to be paid at all. Would you sell an hour of your life for 12 cents? Of course you wouldn't. But the people trapped in the prison system have no choice in the matter. They are required to do the work that is demanded of them. This is slavery. In the past year, inmates have been put to work manufacturing hand sanitizer and PPE, washing hospital laundry, and digging mass graves for COVID victims. In normal years, they provide forced labor for thousands of US corporations, including big names like McDonald's, Wendy's, Tyson, Verizon, Sprint, Fidelity, Walmart, JCPenney, and IBM. Angry yet? It still gets worse. With each passing year, America finds new ways to extract profits from human life. Let's talk about private prisons. As the war on drugs ramped up in the 1980s, federal prisons began to become overcrowded. The solution? Turn to the private sector to build new prisons for all this excess human inventory. The government contracts a private company to build the prisons, that company locks up the overflow prisoners, and in exchange they receive a fixed rate for each inmate. They are paid for each person they imprison. See the problem here? The prison slave labor market is a financial incentive not to pursue prison reform. It would damage the profits of thousands of US companies. But by adding for-profit prisons into the mix, cutting out the middleman, and simply making money off of human storage units, we've ensured that no meaningful reform will ever pass, at least not without a mass movement to demand it. Think about it. Who profits from the existence of private prisons? Private companies are given multi-hundred-million-dollar contracts, then their executives turn around and donate huge sums of that same money to politicians who will support private prisons. It's a never-ending cycle. Corrupt politicians are making money, private prisons are making money, and thousands of US companies are making money from literal slave labor. It makes perfect sense within the US capitalist framework. CoreCivic, formerly Corrections Corporation of America, is the largest private prison manager in the country. In 2019, they raked in $1.98 billion in revenue, all on the backs of exploited human beings, stuffed into their prisons with a price tag on each one. What's even more ridiculous is that the vast majority of the private prison contracts contain a lockup quota. That is, a guaranteed percentage of occupancy for the duration of the agreement. Most of these quotas are set at 90% occupancy, with some even landing an insane 100%. So, in a time when crime rates are the lowest they've been in decades, these private prisons are guaranteed to have their cells filled. If those cells aren't filled, they're still paid as if they were. And guess who pays the bill? US taxpayers. There was one hideous incident in 2008 which became known as the Kids for Cash scandal. 2 judges in Luzerne County, Pennsylvania were found to have been accepting bribes from for-profit correctional facilities to dole out ridiculously harsh sentences for minors. Thousands of children were slapped with extended stays in these private facilities for crimes as minor as making fun of their assistant principal on MySpace. There are few things more depraved than putting innocent children in jail to line your own pocket. So, to recap, the US started the war on drugs which US groups like the CIA were shuttling into the country, began locking people up at unprecedented rates for nonviolent drug offenses, realized we had literally run out of all of our prison space, and decided to contract out private companies in order to lock up more people, and then paid those companies to incarcerate even more people. This system is absurd by any reasonable estimation, and we still haven't even discussed whether or not it's effective. To make a long story short, no, it's not effective. In the United States, we focus more on punishment than rehabilitation, and US prisons are certainly punishment. In fact, they're so inhumane that the United Nations has condemned them as abusive and torturous. And human rights organizations have long asserted that one of the prison industrial complex's favorite tools, solitary confinement, is literal torture. Once someone has been released from prison, it's much harder to find a job. And 2 out of 3 end up right back in a cell because their situation is so desperate. We've even seen people commit tiny crimes and purposefully get arrested because then at least they'd have a roof over their heads. When many Americans hear this, they'll shake their heads and say, you just can't fix some people, completely ignoring the fact that our prison system is not intended to fix anything. Again, this fits in perfectly with the average American mindset. Most people subjected to prison terms are poor. In America, we've been conditioned to believe that poor people are lazy and therefore morally deficient and deserving of punishment. This, of course, ignores the fact that wealthy people are just as likely or even more likely to use drugs. But those people are rarely sentenced, often because they have important parents, or they can pay bail, or simply because their communities aren't heavily policed like lower income areas. We've effectively criminalized poverty. Can't pay a parking ticket? Jail. Can't pay bail? Prison term. No one will hire you when you get out? Serves you right for being a criminal. This mindset is truly horrific. It lacks even the barest shred of basic human decency. We cannot ignore the fact that systemic racism plays a large role in the American prison system. 2 men, 1 white and 1 black, charged for the same crime with the same criminal background, are often given different length prison sentences. Can you guess who gets the longer sentence? On average, black people are given 20% longer sentences for the same crime committed by a white person. Then you have white-collar crime. Banks have engaged in money laundering for drug cartels and other shady operations for years, bankrolling the very industry we throw people away for, and they caused the single largest economic crash since the Great Depression. Did any bankers get locked up for any significant time? Of course not. There are 2 separate justice systems in this country, one for the rich and one for everyone else. It's clear that the US has a long way to go before it can be considered a truly free nation. Our horrific prison industrial complex is a permanent stain on this country's legacy. The systemic racism, use of slave labor, inhumane treatment and outright torture of prisoners, and the commodification of human lives to be locked up in order to increase profits is truly wrong in every way.
The seal and the Constitution reflect the thinking of the Founding Fathers that this was to be a nation by white people and for white people. Native Americans, blacks, and all other non-white people were to be the burden bearers for the real citizens of this nation.